Good afternoon, everybody. Can I welcome you to the introduction to the Learning Scrutiny Committee. Can I welcome to the meeting Darren Joseph, Tracy Pease and Leslie Bush. Just to confirm, as a council, we welcome the use of the Welsh language within our public meetings, but I can confirm I have not received any notifications or requests to use Welsh today. Therefore, the meeting will be conducted in English only. May I remind you that this meeting is being webcast. Therefore, please turn off your mobile phones and please ensure that you speak clearly into the microphones. Can I also remind all members to sign the attendance register and confirm if any apologies have been received for this meeting?
There's no apologies, Chair.
No apologies. Can I move on then to item 2, declarations of interest, and I'd like to bring in Mr Tim James, our legal officer, for some advice. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Chair. Members, the item 3 on the agenda is to consider the funding consultation proposals for schools in Torfaen in relation to the additional learning needs funding, and I anticipate that a number of you will feel that may affect you in that you may be governors at the schools concerned, you may have relatives who either work or attend the schools in question, or you may have relatives who are in receipt of such funding, and that may be a matter which therefore you feel affects you directly. My advice to all members is, in all of those circumstances, it's certainly arguable you have a personal interest and you may wish to declare a personal, non-prejudicial interest on that basis. I don't regard any of you in those circumstances as having a prejudicial interest, so my advice to members is that they declare a personal interest and that they can carry on and remain in the meeting and speak to the item on the agenda. And I think, Chair, probably easiest, therefore, if each of the members who feels they may be affected in that way can declare their interest, and perhaps we can start with yourself, if that's okay.
I declare that I am Chair of Nant Celyn School Governors. I also have a grandchild in Blenheim Road Community School, and I have a relative as a staff member in Abersycon Comprehensive School.
I'd like to declare that I am a governor of Newing Primary School.
I declare that I'm a community governor up at Abersycon High School.
Councillor Shepherd, to Bethel Ward, I don't wish to declare any personal prejudicial interest.
Councillor Chris Tew, I got 3 children at Victoria School.
Councillor Lynn Caron, I'm the Chair of Governors at Llanrabban Primary and a Member of Governors at Crosscarlio Comprehensive.
Councillor Kelly Preston, I'm on the Governors of Cwmbran High School and I have a relative that attends Cwmbran High School.
Councillor Dave Thomas, I'm a Governor at Llantarnam Primary School. I have a daughter that attends that school and a son that attends Llanrabban Primary School.
And Councillor Ray Williams, I'm Governor of Garntech School.
Councillor Cathy Evans, I have relatives attending Coidiva Primary.
Thank you, members. Can I just also remind members that they should record the declarations on the appropriate sheet that's going around with the attendance register. Thank you.
Can we move on then to item 3 on our agenda, which is the ALN funding consultation, proposals for schools in Torfaen. And we have Darren Joseph, Leslie Bush and Tracy Pease. I just wondered, we have the report in front of us, the brief report. I just wonder whether you'd just like perhaps to give us a 10-minute perhaps briefing on the report before we start on our question strategy.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Hopefully we'll have a chance to read the report. It should, with any luck, be fairly straightforward. It's trying to outline the process that we followed in terms of the consultation round this year to move forward with our ALN funding formula changes. So this is part of an ongoing process. We changed the funding formula at the beginning of 16-17, following full consultation with schools and the wider school community. So 17-18, sorry, for 17-18. This is the next stage of that for 18-19. So it's the same formula, but with some updates to it. So the consultation document, which is attached, took the consultees, which is all schools, head teachers, governing bodies, the schools forum, through the various changes that were being proposed, and asked for comments about that, on those at each point. There's a further appendix at the back of your papers, which basically gives you the financial change school by school. So you can see the effect of the formula changes that are proposed in this round as opposed to the allocations that were distributed to schools in the current financial year. So 17-18 figures comparing to proposed figures for 18-19. There's various impacts. Obviously, you'll see that some schools are losing, obviously some schools are gaining, and that's because of the effect of the data that we're gathering and capturing in the funding formula, as well as the changes to the formula itself. So, for example, School Action Plus numbers, which is a big part of the formula allocation, will have moved in individual schools, and that will be having an effect. Free school meal entitlement will have gone up or down in individual schools, and that will be having an effect. And as well as that, in terms of the funding formula, we've changed such aspects of the formula in terms of, say, the count. So the count date previously for School Action Plus was based on 3-year data, and the proposal now is to move to 1-year data. Yeah? So all of the things that we're referencing here in the consultation document and the report will have an individual impact on a school. So you can't say, that's why this school's gone up, without looking at the effects on the data and the changes at an individual level. But you've got the information there that shows you the ups and downs across each of the schools. And the changes really are very straightforward in that firstly the pupil count has changed from the 3-year capture date to the 1-year capture date. And we are moving certain funds from or certain aspects of the funding out of contingency funds, where we've been funding, for example, increases to numbers in S&RBs. We're moving that into the main funding formula for 18-19, so it comes out to the main distribution. Yeah, so whereas in 17-18 we allocated about £80,000 to pilot a new approach in resource bases, where we increased the number of places in resource bases, we are making that permanent in the proposals for 18-19 and funding that out of the core allocation. Yeah, so it's not a huge movement on from the picture that we had in 17-18. We had a funding formula that we consulted on at that point, and this is an iteration of it, and the intention is to develop that further. So there's likely to be further proposals brought forward over this coming year that'll be consulted upon for the 19-20 financial year, that'll make further adjustments to the formula. But it's probably best, Chair, if we just go through the questions that are in the consultation document one by one, because that I think will take you through the whole process of the changes. All right, okay.
So theme 1 then is the consultation process. And we have some questions on that. Can you tell us, how were the head teachers' comments and feedback from last year's consultation taken on board and contributed to the amendments to the proposals implemented for 2017-18?
So the proposals that we brought forward for 17-18 went through exactly the same process as this. Yeah, there was a consultation document produced, there were consultation events, as there had been this time. And when those responses came in from individuals or the school's forum or school governing bodies, they were taken into account in the final report that went to the exec member, which will be the same case now this time. All of that will be fed into a final report to the executive member. And a decision will be made at that point on whether to proceed. So for last year, All of those things were taken into consideration. There were no changes that the executive member made to the formula proposals, but we did add in an additional aspect of use of the contingency. So whereas the contingency allocation could have been used, our proposal for 1718 was that it could have been used for cases new to Torvine or newly identified life-changing circumstances or new exceptional circumstances. Those are the purposes under which we proposed that we would use the contingency fund. The executive member requested that we add an additional line, and that was to support those schools where exceptional change management is required during the transition period. So, and we have used that during this financial year to allocate some funds to schools that are in that position of requiring additional support because of the exceptional circumstances they were in.
Okay. Councillor Preston, sorry.
During the consultation process, were there other parties that should have been included, perhaps parents?
The consultation process is a statutory description under the school funding formula and the school funding regulations how to go about and who to consult with. So all of the statutory consultees were consulted with as part of it, and that is prescribed under the school funding formula regulations.
Mr. President, you wish to come back in on that? Sorry.
So that's the statutory process. Do you have to stick rigidly within that, or are you able to consult further if there's an authority you so choose to?
I suppose it's the relevance of the consultation, I suppose, that this is about distributing funding within delegated school budgets. So this is a fairly small part, actually, of the whole delegated school budget allocation. And therefore, the way described in the funding regulations is to consult with those that are affected. Now, obviously, once the money goes into an individual school budget, it's for the head teacher and the governing body to decide how best to allocate that to support the needs of children across the whole spectrum of the delivery of education. But in terms of the consultation around how we get money from the local authority into school budgets, the consultation is, as I say, as it is described, with the consultees being the head teachers, the governing bodies, and the schools forum in this case.
Yeah, it was brought to our attention, obviously, by one of those schools that are losing a significant amount of funds at the meeting on Tuesday, that it was difficult for them, given that their funding had dropped so significantly and they were expecting to have redundancies. It was difficult for them to explain to parents that their pupils, or that their children, would not be receiving the same level of resource that they had been previously used to. Is there anything we could do about that in terms of, getting our comms team to assist, or because it does seem to me that is a problem that, we to put it bluntly, we're causing the school a problem, and the school has got to pass it on, and it does seem to me as if it's not really their fault. So in those terms, perhaps it might be useful if we could help.
I think this is, you can apply this issue to the whole general distribution of funding into schools. We've looked at various aspects of the school's funding formula over time. It's just that more recently we've been focusing on the ALN aspects of it. And inevitably what happens when you change the way that funding is distributed via the funding methodology is there'll be some schools that will gain money and there'll be some schools that will do less well off than they were previously. The issue, I suppose, about it is whether that new distribution methodology is easy to understand, is fair, and is equitably, consistently distributing money in the best way, and whether the school community and others that we're consulting with subject to that consultation process and subject to that funding formula, agree that that's the best way of distributing the money. So I certainly take on board the idea of communication. It could be communicating this differently, perhaps in future, in terms of newsletters or something that we'd get out through governing bodies or to schools, or to coordinate differently with schools, as a support from the local authority. But in terms of whether we can do anything other than that, we've got the contingency fund that will allow for additional funding where it's needed in exceptional circumstances. And other than that, it's about being assured and keeping it under review so that we can maintain that assurance that this is the best way of distributing the funding into school budgets.
Tell us how many responses were received from this year's consultation, please.
There was 13 responses. I was going to try and collate this for the scrutiny committee, but we've been in the ALN group meeting on Monday. We were speaking to the head teachers Wednesday, so we haven't had time to do it yet. And so I can only give you a brief sort of overview verbally. But there's 13 responses in total from schools. They're broadly positive. Yeah, so across all of the questions that have been asked, the vast majority of responses that have been received are positive. Where there's some disagreement from colleagues, it usually is around where the funding should come from to cover the costs of this. So, for example, in one of the questions we asked, should we fund the increase of places and resource bases from this pot of money? And some schools and head teachers, governors are saying, yeah, that's the best thing to do, and some are saying, well, no, we should find more money, or we should go to Welsh Government, or we should look for additional funding sources. Now, we're obviously doing all those things, but we're in a period of financial austerity. Actually, our funding position is getting worse. So there is no other place to look for the funding unless it was a case of just redistributing it through the general schools funding formula. And in talking to head teachers previously through the last round of consultation in the build-up to this, the views have certainly been most strongly that we should be capturing this within the ALN funds that are available in total. So we've got £3.4 million available for this purpose in schools' delegated budgets for mainstream support. We're moving some of that across into resource bases now to fund the extra places for in the resource bases. A couple of 100,000, but 180,000 of it is moving across to there. And we're looking at other funding sources from within the authority, such as, for example, the money that we spend on out-of-county provision. Yes, we spend about £1.5 million on out-of-county places. A lot of that is offset by other out-of-county, or rather other counties buying places off us. Yeah, so there's a recoupment into the local authority and net some of that off. But overall, we are spending on out-of-county placements. And one of the things we want to look at as a further development is whether that mixture is right between out-of-county placements, in-county placements, and the type of out-of-county and in-county placement we're procuring and using. So it may be over time that we can switch money around there, but that is not something for the immediate future. So those are the sort of comments we've had back in terms of the consultation response. Broadly positive. In the case of some questions, entirely positive. Where there are negatives in there, they're around funding allocations, questions about whether we could find money from other sources, which we're exploring. And there's a few comments back from schools as well in terms of wishing for us to look at a more sophisticated model of funding allocation, which again we are doing through the ALN group, and I don't know whether Tracy wants to speak a little bit more about that.
It's on. Yeah, can I just say that the consultation of last year and this year have actually helped us to refine and develop our processes. So the 1 year, looking at the 1 year count came about because we thought about the 3 year count last year, but we had a school that came to us and said, look, my numbers have really gone up. Pontywerddin was shut down. I've had very many more pupils. That's not reflected. So we went to the 1 year count because we felt that would actually be more relevant and current for those schools. So if they were to have a large number of pupils, we would be able to include it. And I think that the going forward, sort of looking at that moderation of pupils at School Action Plus, we've been working long and hard with the ALNCOs so that they have, we would confidently say that they've got a good grasp now of what a School Action Plus pupil is, and that good practice has sort of been taken back to schools and they've looked at their registers, but then there is, School Action Plus is quite a broad category, so some schools have said, and we've agreed, that perhaps we should make that more sophisticated and say that there are degrees of School Action Plus, if you like, but that's something that we need to work on. So this is an evolving, developing process, but I think, you know, the more that we're doing it, the more sophisticated we're becoming and better at it. Do you want to speak?
Councillor Shepherd. Did you want me to say anything on that? I'm Leslie, I'm the head teacher at Cranbridge, so just to put in context a bit, you know, that part of this work is being structured around the school-to-school group, which is the Elenco group Darren and Tracy have spoken of. And there are 9 schools, as well as my own Cranbridge school, where are representatives of the school Elenco, or the head senior managers, who've come together to work with Tracy and Darren to come up with the most responsive, sort of fit-for-purpose tool we can get to. So what we're talking about today is something that's been consulted on as an ongoing process by at least half-termly, if not monthly, meetings of these 9 schools with officers. So I think we'd all agree one of the things that have come through from the 13 schools that have responded is there are still schools who in their own specific context, like Darren explained earlier, the combination of the free school meals with the amount of School Action Plus and the level of that School Action Plus is so individual to each context that some of the comments are about more individual contexts. So as a group, we're committed to looking at each individual context as well. So we're looking at the formula and working with the local authority to come up with a formula, School Action Plus, when is the count, how much FSM is included in that, and we still need to sophisticate that. We're having feedback continually, but at the same time, we're saying while we're introducing this, we know that as the individual situation plays out in each different school, we need to have a mechanism where they can come and say, yeah, but can you look at my school in particular? And that's a theme that's been going on. Each school is able to ask the group to look at their school in particular, 2 members of the group, and we make sure that a school representative, so another Elenco from a similar school. So if it's a big junior school, we try and make sure we send a colleague that's a peer from a bigger primary school along, so that we can try and get further under the skin of how this is playing out in schools, because we want to inform and work with the local authority on how to get the best formula, but at the same time, being schools, we want to support each other. So I think from the 13 schools, it seems to be overall, there's no pattern of a message or 2 coming through strongly, but there are individual contexts coming through that we are committed to work towards, and reassure people that even from now, as soon as this consultation is complete, we'll be able to go out and say, tell me the story about your school, so we can come back to the contingency and hopefully help transition the change towards the next phase. So we have got 9 of the schools that are involved in it as well. So I said it's not a smooth journey, it's not an easy journey, but it's probably one that's necessarily needing to be done in a rigorous manner, so that we're not relying on a lot of anecdotal evidence, because quite a lot of ALN and special needs is personal, isn't it? It's about a pupil, and you need to know the pupil, but you also need some moderation tool, so that some schools, each school's organising themselves differently, so you need to know how a school is responding to their special needs profile, in order to moderate it with another school that might think they are worse off than that school. Does that make sense? So it's trying to get the formula, but the consultation being able to be ongoing with peers from 9 schools.
Going back to the out-of-county money that we spend, what's the relationship vice versa, coming into Torfaen? And what's the procedure of that money going from yourself into the school? Because we had a very, very worrying conversation in the pre-meeting about a child that came into county, and the allocated funds came with the child, but they never actually got to the school. The procedure they had to go through to get the money, they never received the funds.
So the out-of-county funding and the money that comes into county from recoupment is outside of this consultation and outside of this stream of money. Yeah. So that fund, the 1.5 million we spend and the million or so that we recoup in, is not delegated to schools. It sits within the Education Service budget. But we are spending out net on that to the tune of 500,000 or so per annum. Now, yes, funding comes in from individual authorities, and in some cases, rather unhelpfully, that money comes in with a specified expectation in terms of how that will be used. What we've done more latterly over the last year or so, and Tracy again probably would want to come in on this, in working with the South East Wales region across the ALN leads, is try to get to a position where local authorities are not doing that, because it's got to be about what support is right for the individual children, the groups of children in the school, rather than specifically specifying X number of hours or X type of support to the child. So there are some legacy issues in terms of that, where money has come into the local authority at a specified level for specified types of support from other authorities. And once that is into the local authority, it becomes part of the Education Service budget. Yeah? So how the schools are funded to look after those children, to support those children, is through a different mechanism, which is this funding formula. Yeah? So in Torfaen, regardless of whether the child comes from out of county or not, the funding is distributed to them in total through this formula, which is for the whole population of needs of ALN in that school, rather than at an individual child level.
Sorry.
Well, there was a couple of questions I was going to ask earlier, but we've skipped on like two themes at the moment. But drag us back a little bit to the consultation process. Are you telling us that this funding is top slice from the school's budget?
This funding is part of the delegated schools budget.
So it's not our centrally held budget, it's the school's budget.
This funding that we're talking about, yeah. The outer county budget and the recoupment budget are not the ALN budget.
Sorry about that. And I would like to come back to that issue that was brought up by Councillor Shepherd, in that if there's a statement for a child that's coming in from out of county, can we do that? Can we, does that statement not say whatever that statement says, and therefore should that money not be directly passported?
I think because we've delegated the ALN budgets to schools, it means they can be more flexible. If you have a statement that says you have to have 6 hours of support for that pupil, and as Darren's absolutely right, we've tried to move away from that because it does tie your hands, if you like, if you get that kind of statement. So we are trying to work on a sort of a pan-Gwent basis and come up with statements that talk more about high levels of support, medium levels of support and low levels of support. And our other partners have come along with us, but there are legacy statements out there. And I think if you have that, it means that you are, your hands are tied, if you like, about how creative and innovative you could be around your funding.
I think you... And as a consequence, it seems to me that don't get me wrong, I'm not saying like 6 hours or anything like that. I mean, if that's in the statement, that's in the statement. But what I mean is, if a pupil comes in and funding follows that pupil from Newport or Blaenau Gwent or wherever, then surely, because it's on a statement, that funding should be automatically passported.
So there are a few schools, and we need to quantify this in terms of the volume and impact on individual schools, and we've committed to do this. There are a few schools in that very position, who are identifying to us that they have still got children that are coming with specified support needs from other authorities, and in making that and managing that in their individual school, it is impacting on their ability to support wider groups of other children. So we are looking at that. We committed to the head teachers only yesterday that we would look at some case studies and we would do some work through the ALN group on examining the scale and the impact of that. And we have got the existing mechanism, which is the ALN contingency fund, to be able to support schools in the short term should that require an additional funding allocation. Yeah. So we're in the past, so for 17-18 we looked at schools that had gained or lost in this case, a significant sum of money through the transition from an old formula to the new formula. When we went and looked at those individual cases, there was good reason to provide additional funding to some schools, and they were given it from the contingency fund. In the similar way, where we are identifying that these legacy issues still exist now in this year, for schools that have got children that come with these specified statements, we'll quantify that and we'll look to support them through a transition period via the contingency fund.
Sorry, but that you know, if I can come, that still doesn't seem right. If the pupil has got a statement, we have to, as I understand it, by law, do whatever that statement says. And let's put it another way, right? If one of our pupils went to Blaenau Gwent, and I heard Blaenau Gwent were not passporting that money directly to a pupil, I would bring it up in council and I would request that we stopped paying Blaenau Gwent that money, because we are giving it for a pupil. We're not giving it for Blaenau Gwent's education system, whether it's ALN or not ALN.
I think you hit the nail on the head, is that isn't what we're doing. What we're doing is providing funding, and those authorities have agreed, all of our partners have agreed, that they are giving funding to us to support children in our settings to the appropriate level. Yeah, and what's happened is that we've still got some statements out there that have got written on them these number of hours of this particular type of support. So it's a case of supporting that with additional funding allocations in the short term until that is removed, where we haven't got that kind of specific statement in future. It isn't a case of saying that we're not going to support those children to that level. It's a case of supporting the children to the level that is required, yeah, and making sure that all other children in the school are supported as necessary. And if we need to allocate additional funding to do that, we'll do it through the contingency fund.
Let's come back with a quickly on that, right? I mean, if we had some nice posh pupil from a nice posh family come here from Monmouth into this authority with a statement, and we did that, and because they're from a nice posh family, they took us for judicial review, do you think we've got a hope in hell of winning that judicial review?
Sorry, I think you're misunderstanding the point. We are not meeting the needs of those children. Yeah, there are no children where another authority has specified that they require this, that, or the other, and we are not meeting those requirements. We are meeting those requirements, yeah, because it's a duty on us to do so. What we're sort of flagging, and what schools have flagged to us, is that in doing that, it creates additional pressure on the budget in those situations where some authorities have identified that specific requirement, because they're having to meet the need, and they are doing so, but they are having to call on other resources to do it. And that's where we would look through the contingency allocation as necessary to allocate additional funds to schools where appropriate.
The schools are picking up some of that funding then?
Potentially the schools are picking up, are using other parts of their school budget to support ALN. Yeah? Just as schools are picking up the costs of additional teaching where they have chosen to do it, or where they are paying for extra capitation, or paying for a building change, or anything else. Yeah, all of that is within the gift of the individual school through the delegated school budget. The difference here is that we have got an existing anomaly, which we've recognised through the ALN group, and we've recognised with the head teachers, that there are some statements still there where there are specific needs identified in them, and we are going to capture that through a case study process with those schools affected by it, and look to support them as we need to with additional funding while this transition goes on.
Do you wish to? Was your question been answered now?
So if we've got a child out the county that comes in statement in needs one-to-one, and then obviously the funding goes into the educational system, so the school then has to pick up through their own budget of taking care of this child one-to-one, but that funding's already gone into the educational system. So the child is been used to having one-to-one, that if the school cannot provide the one-to-one, but it's already been paid for. So surely that's... If the child is used to having the one-to-one service, and then obviously it's enough of an upturn in the child's life to go into a new school, new area, and then it's still the needs are not being met.
Yeah, there's no evidence that the needs are not being met. Yeah? Where a child has been receiving that support previously, there's nothing saying we're not providing that support anyway now. Yeah, it's individual schools are continuing to provide that support. What it means is that those individual schools may be struggling currently to fund all of that from the ALN funding that's being allocated, maybe supplementing it. Where they are doing that, we need to identify it, and we would then look to provide additional funding to support them through the contingency fund. So there is no case that we're not providing support in individual schools to do it, and no head teachers have flagged that to us.
Just a quickie on that, really. I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying. I do have a concern, however, that if a local authority was paying us £5,000 a year for one-to-one support for a pupil with a statement, and the case happened, as I said before, some posh family from Monmouth decided to go for judicial review because they felt that we weren't spending £5,000 on that pupil. Do you think it would be difficult for us to defend that position? Because what I'm saying here is then the school would have to look to fund that money, and it would be difficult, I suspect, for the school to prove that they were giving that £5,000 worth to that pupil. I mean, I'm just thinking about this now. Legal conundrum for us, and I would hate to see us fall down on that one.
If there were pupils and they did have, for example, those 6 hours in that statement, or possibly one-to-one, then that's where we sort of almost tie the hands of schools, because they're going to have to do that first and take that out of their available resource. So it does, if you like, pose issues. I mean, it's what we're trying to do going forward with our colleagues as well is look to a system which is less prescriptive, because we know that helps the pupil. And with, for example, we're looking at, obviously with the new ALM bill, we're looking at something other than statements. So we're looking for these individual development plans to have a description, and it's being piloted in Caerphilly at the moment, and we're looking to sort of take it across the region, is that in their EP reports that go to statemented panel for formal assessment, they've actually got a sort of a script for parents to follow, which says a typical day for your son or daughter looks like this, and that makes much more sense than saying, right, there's 6 hours, and that 6 hours is going to provide whatever, because it's sometimes in statements it's not helpful, it's just to that number of hours, support by that number of people. So what we have, and it's only a few schools affected who have taken out of county pupils at the moment, but it's about trying to work with them so that they can come to contingency, so they're not struggling as they would, because they're having their creativity is being sort of held back because they've got to meet these requirements.
Sorry. Sorry, I'm not sure you're actually answering any of you the part of the question that I would like answered. If a child moves from Blaenau Gwent into Torfaen, and for the sake of example, £15,000 ALN funding follows with that child from Blaenau Gwent, that money is then swallowed up into the educational system. And if the school never receives that £15,000 from any means at all for that child when Blaenau Gwent have sent it, are we not on very, very dodgy legal grounds with that?
The school are receiving funding through this mechanism. Yeah, the fact that the money comes into the local authority that is being recouped from other authorities is of no link to this funding at all. We have had this conversation with the head teachers going through the previous consultation process, and there is that existing issue currently where local authorities historically have said a child comes into the borough with X amount of money for X purpose, and that is very specifically described in the number of hours or type of support or both. That isn't happening now, and the whole region has agreed to move to the same position as Esware, which Tracy has just described, which is about making sure that the child is supported appropriately, rather than being specific about it. There are some existing issues that we know of in individual schools. There are a few of those, but there are some where those schools have got existing children that are coming in from out of county. And where the school requires additional support to support those children or to support the wider ALN needs in the school, they have got a mechanism to come and ask for that funding, which is through the contingency fund. In terms of what the authority does to support those individual children and the issue around an individual authority paying us a sum of money to access one of our places, this is all well described between the local authorities, and the local authorities all know what they're procuring from Torvine, and we know what we're procuring from them.
Because we have a partnership agreement.
Because there are partnership agreements in place for each of the places they're procuring.
So what you're saying, there are some legacy issues. You said legacy issues. So can we be assured then that the schools that are sort of involved in those legacy issues will be supported from the contingency fund, and they won't have to go through hoops to get that funding, and that funding goes to the child when it's needed?
Yes, you are assured of that. There is a contingency route. It goes through the ALN group. And the needs of the school are considered in terms of whether an additional allocation is required. The needs of the school are not considered at the level of an individual child. They're considered at the needs of the whole ALN population in the school. But clearly, where there is this legacy issue, that'll be a fundamental part of the conversation, the discussion through the ALN group about whether that school should receive additional funding. And we have given that commitment to the head teachers only yesterday.
So will that be more or less guaranteed, or will they have to still go through hoops or satisfy your criteria to get that money?
I'm not sure what you're asking, Councillor Thomas.
I'm just saying, if there's a legacy issue and you're saying that they should have, that money, is that more or less guaranteed from the contingency, or are there still conditions that they need to meet?
I think what would happen is the school would make the case, that they have got a particular need for a particular reason, and that would be presented through the ALN panel, and the ALN group would then discuss whether and how much additional funding would be allocated in that case. I suppose what I'm flagging with you is that one of the ways in which a school may receive funding this year is because of this legacy issue. So another way may be because of a new child transferred into Torvine, as described under the contingency currently.
I mean, I don't want to labour. We've laboured this long and hard now, and I don't wish to labour it any further. But I would suggest that perhaps we take some legal advice on this, because it isn't another authority that I'm worried about. It's a parent I'm worried about who could, because it's great to say, right, £5,000's come in from Caerphilly for a pupil that's come in. And then we're going to give them contingency funding of £1,800, right, because they've come in from another authority, to fund that child, and then that's got to be funded from the school. The rest of it's got to be funded from the school budget. I mean, because I assume that we are talking about that child getting what it says on the statement. So what worries me is that parent would make a complaint about that, and I don't think we'd have a leg to stand on. But it is then an issue that the other pupils in that school are now suffering, because that school's having to make up £2,800 worth of extra funding out of its own budget and affecting the other pupils. So I don't, I understand exactly what you've told me, and I understand exactly how the system works. I've just got some doubts about whether or not we would survive a judicial inquiry of some sort into what we're doing.
If I could just come back just very briefly on a point of a point of clarification that might help everybody. The idea is to move us away from funding individual children with individual funding sums. So whereas in the past we've had a panel process and schools have come and bid for individual funding allocations for those children, this is a way of distributing the full 3.4 million according to a funding formula. So it doesn't allocate to individual children. Once the money goes into the school budget, it gets put together with all the rest of the money in the school budget, and then the head teacher and the teachers and the governors decide how best to spend that whole sum of money. If there are shortages in doing that for any purpose, whether it's ALN or anything else, then the school can come back to the local authority and say that there's an exceptional circumstance of some sort which would be looked at and potentially supported.
Just a quick question you said about this pilot from Caerphilly. You're going away from these statements, and it's going to be more of a statement to the parent. This is what your typical child's day is going to look like. Surely that's going to be in the current situation with the high pressure on some school budgets, especially secondary schools. Isn't that going to be a bit more woolly, and is that not going to focus attention on the children that really need that help, especially with the local authorities' stated intention last year to really look at the lower ability groups and their specific needs? Isn't that just going to make it even more vague? Because if the school's under immense pressure with its teaching, the size of its classrooms, potentially with redundancies coming up in certain secondary schools, particularly those high FSM, isn't that just going to make things a little more fuzzy and not specific, which a statement is? Because a statement at the end of the day will say exactly what that child requires. Where you saying your typical day of your child is going to be this, I'm sorry, but I find that very vague and no meaning in it.
It's not vague in as much as you can say at the beginning of the day that you may require one-to-one to sort of take you in the morning, to settle you down, to get you to your group. So it is more about pinpointing, if you like. I think that the problem with having statements that give you hours is that as a school you would have to, sort of meet that need straight off, and then it does make it much more difficult for you to think about how you're going to use funds later on. So if you have a one-to-one with a pupil who, and I had one, the first time I ever had an LSA in a classroom was I had a statement that had a one-to-one for a particular pupil, but he didn't need his one-to-one all the time, and actually it wasn't helping him to be independent, but I could actually use that person then to be able to help the other pupils in the class. So this particular funding that we're giving is actually frees up schools to be able to use their funding in a much more creative way. They're not hidebound by it. And I think, going forward, the whole IDP process, which will repair statements under the new ALN bill, is more about making absolutely sure that you're meeting need, that you're not just, coming to a panel and saying, right, an LSA for 6 hours, that'll do. And all those statements, all those IDPs would have to be reviewed every year. So if something wasn't working, then it would be changed annually and an annual review anyway. So it's very much an ongoing process. And pupil needs change, especially from year to year. So you need to respond to that at your statementing reviews.
Can I just add, certainly from the commitment of the 9 schools that are on the ALN group, that actually live this situation like yourselves on a day-to-day basis, having pupils coming from other counties, but also sending our pupils out to county, that the 9 schools together with the officers we've spent a lot of time at the beginning thinking about this particular issue, and I feel like it's not yet the finished product, and just assure you that certainly the 9 schools with the officers are saying that this is something that we need to continue work on, and as soon as this consultation is complete, we'll be able to get on and be able to come back to you to say how that's worked out, because I think I'm picking up what happens at my school and what Tracy's saying, whether you have a statement or not, it's your needs that are important. The level of my need, I might have parents that go and get me a statement, I might have the same level of need, but my parents are not able to access statement in review. So it's my needs that are important. It's important that schools meet my need. What we're trying to get with the schools involved in it is that's what we're trying to do on a daily basis, aren't we? And we're trying to make sure sure that the children with statements and the children without statements are getting their needs met. Some of that money is going to come through the Torfaen system of this formula, which needs to be added to and changed in the next year or two. But some of it also comes in from other counties who are buying places within Torfaen. And what we're trying to work through with the officers is that how is the best way of making sure that money isn't sucked up into an education budget, but it's actually still part of the special educational ALN needs budget, that actually also, and I don't want to throw something else in to complicate things, but as well as my school having children from other county, occasionally one of my pupils will need to leave to go out of county and cost Torfaen something like 60, 70 grand for one place. So the money for special needs is given out, as I've just described, which we're working on, but the group is committed to making sure any money that's coming into the local authority, we do track with the officers and do case studies, because it's our children that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. But the other thing we've got to know is that when we're saying we don't think we can meet need within Torfaen, that somewhere there's a sum of money that's able to go and buy a place somewhere else. And I think we're still working through those three big parts of the special, the ALN budget. Because if a school this is happening regularly, not to a minority, but regularly. This month there might be a student in one Torfaen school at a junior age, and there isn't a place that people can feel meet their needs in Torfaen. So we've got to go back to a pot and say, where's the money coming to pay for out of county? So at the moment, we really want to track that money coming in from other authorities, as well as the money we are sending out to other authorities, and that contingency fund, I think, for the 9 schools and the officers, saying while we're working through that, we've got that contingency fund that we want to fairly and equitably give to make sure all kids' needs are met. And picking up on the point that if that means that money's come in from another county, we want to go to that school and really understand, well, how many of those pupils have you got? But also we want to make sure that the school down the road who haven't got as many statement are getting money as well. So in a long-winded way, the short answer is the 9 schools and the officers are committed to starting. We started already. When can we get together and get this case study started for these pupils and this incoming money, so that we can all be assured that the pupils are getting what they need, whether they got a statement or not, but the county, Torfaen, is getting the money they need, and we're all using it and understanding it as best we can.
Can I ask, when do you think that piece of work will be finished, and when could we have a look at it again?
We're meeting on the 2nd of February to look at some moderation. We want to get in to these schools, before half term. The ones particularly the ones. We don't want to only go to the people that have responded to the consultation, because there might be others out there, but certainly that's the place to start, isn't it? Because they've actually given us the raw data. Yeah. But we want to get out to those schools as case studies with the Elencos from the schools as well, and come back as soon as possible, so that by the time the budget is built for April onwards, Darren has got as much information as he can get to fairly distribute the money. So next week onwards, or as soon as this consultation, while it's still going on, you can't really necessarily implement the work, can you? But we're sort of raring to go, because we know that schools are going to be starting building their budget. As governors, you're going to be discussing what money you've got available, and the sooner we can go and understand that in greater depth to help Darren and the contingency fund allocate it, the better, really.
Can I just add to that? This is a listening consultation as well. So when we went out to consultation the first time, the one thing that we did hear from schools was that we didn't have enough specialist provision. So it was difficult for mainstream schools to meet the needs of the young pupils that they had. So as a result of that, we increased specialist provision. So we have listened, and we've listened to the people who've come in around the 1-year funding. We've listened to that. And with this consultation, that point of view about having to meet the needs of these pupils with very prescribed pieces of paper with them, if you like, we've taken that on board, and that's a piece of work that we will do, and do that quickly to make sure we're responding. So we are always listening and developing.
Are there any other questions then on theme 2 that we want to ask? Councillor?
Thank you. Moving on from that. One of the things that came out of the pre-meet is when looking at if a child meets the School Action Plus criteria, there seemed to be some sort of level of confusion as to whether you look at there's a code of conduct, I understand, or code of practice, thank you, or there's guidance by Torfaen County Borough Council, and that some were using one, some were using another, and there wasn't a consistent approach. Is there anything happening around that?
We have a code of practice. So within that code of practice, if you like to give additional guidance and help to school, we took it through the ALNCO group to actually give them more guidance. So it's to supplement, if you like, the code of practice, because the code of practice on School Action Plus is sort of one page, if you like, but our guidance sort of says you could be School Action Plus if this is happening. Or if this is not happening, you won't be School Action Plus. So the document was written to help, if you like, schools to make their decision about whether they were School Action Plus or not. And we've done an awful lot of work with ALNCO. So every meeting that we've had over the last year, and more than that, has been about moderating. So it's about bringing a School Action Plus pupil, talking to your peers and thinking about whether you're sure they're School Action Plus or not. And that was the decision we made.
Thank you. Are those meetings well attended? Because there was a definite feel in the room at our pre-meeting. There was a definite feel that some people are using the code of practice and some people are using the guidance provided by Torfaen, not as a supplementary additional piece of guidance, but it was actually described as almost two separate things. If a pupil is School Action Plus. So I just wondered, are those meetings well attended?
Yes, they are. I think there is only one code of practice, which is that, and everyone has got that. And the LN group, with the 9 schools, looked at, they broke up into subgroups to make sure that that code of practice could be interpreted in a fair and equitable way across the local authority. So any information that was given was additional. And then every Elenco meeting that's held, all schools have got, in a way, I guess it's twofold. It's run for the Elencos, but there's also a responsibility the schools send their Elenco. So all the meetings we've been to, we've talked about, Tracy takes a register, and we're looking to become more sophisticated to be able to track, which schools are able to get that information by regular attendance, because if we're running those meetings regularly, people need to go to them to access the information. But certainly, if schools have changed Elencos, because that's what happens, isn't it? Schools are dynamic places, people leave. There might be a new Elenco, so you're starting again. But I think in a school, we've also said, one of the things we're going to be looking at and encouraging and supporting is that every school has its own moderation of School Action Plus, so that the head teacher and the Elenco and the class teacher themselves have run through it in their school, so they're understanding it properly. Because you could speak to a group of head teachers and a group of Elencos, and if the heads and the Elencos haven't been together, then there might be a disjoint between what they're both understanding. So the Elenco meetings are well attended. The head teachers, we want to get more in the sort of operational, but we want to make sure that when you go to a school, that we say, how did you come up with that School Action Plus register? Has the head and the Elenco taken a few and moderated them together? So as far as I could see, there is only one code of practice. That's the code of practice. There was additional guidance to help. The Elencos have been given the opportunity to talk to one another, and now we're going out to schools to talk in a school to say, how does the Elenco talk to class teachers about what School Action Plus is in their school? Yeah. So that might be something that, if there is confusion out there, that would be something that we could shift and clarify reasonably quickly. Yeah.
So it was a definite question. Which piece do we use? Do we use Torfaen's guidance or the code of practice? It's a question. So the confusion is obviously there.
Torvine's guidance starts off with a code of practice definition, and it was developed to sort of make it easier for people to come to a decision. The meetings that we've had have been themed. So, for example, the theme that we had on Tuesday afternoon was around behavioural, emotional and social difficulties. So all of the talk that afternoon was around that. We had presentations from counselling service, but we've tried to do that, and that has helped answer quite a lot of questions. And in that environment, Elencos feel that they can ask, well, what do you think? What makes you think that? And they can actually ask us as well, and their ALN link officer.
Mr. Cowan, sorry.
So do you think that what you're talking about there, not the two code of practices, but the code of practice and the supplement, are in any way addressing, you talk in your document about addressing the inconsistencies in the way school data is entered and their returns for School Action Plus. Is that the reason why there's these inconsistencies, or is there a different reason?
I think there's been inconsistencies historically that the head teachers have sort of flagged with us and the ALN group, really, in that they haven't been confident that everybody is completing their PLAS data in the same way, and the PLAS data is what is being used to capture the data. So the idea, I think, behind the moderation is to get to a position where everybody is together sharing and understanding and getting towards as consistent approach as possible to collating the data onto that return. We've moved from using the PLAS data to a specific return which is done in the September at the same time in every school, or the October currently, but we're going to try to move it forward to September. So, in the moderation process that's going to go on now over the next few months to check and look and work with individual schools to help them and give us better assurance and give them better assurance that it is consistent, should improve things further. So it's part of that sort of developmental approach to improving things. We've gone from a capture of data that was just pulled out of PLASC, depending on however any individual school chose to complete it, to data that is captured at the same time in every individual school via the same capture, following a process of building that understanding and sharing that way of producing the data individually. And now we're going to have a moderation process on top of it to check.
I wonder, consequently, if the moderation process is therefore necessary, because if you change the system in which this information is uploaded, presumably you've improved the local authority guidance on this issue. It seems to me that it's fairly, I'm no expert on School Action Plus, but it seems to me that it should be fairly simple in the vast majority of cases to be able to input this data. In some, I appreciate that in some cases, particularly where there's issues around mental health, it will be considerably more difficult. But in sort of physical issues and severe emotional issues, in the vast majority of cases, it would be fairly simple. So is there really a need for moderation if you've altered the system, or should you wait until you've got the next set of results out of the new system that you put in before you decide on moderation?
I think there's two issues with it, maybe more, but I think there's two at least, which are that in the first instance, the School Action Plus data has changed quite a lot. So from the 3-year count that we've used for the 17-18 funding to the 1-year count that we're using for the 2018-19 funding, the pupil numbers in total have changed quite a bit, so a couple of hundred pupils extra are now captured in the School Action Plus. So it's appropriate for us to all check that their understanding is embedded and shared and has got a consistent approach in individual schools, through the moderation process. But the other strong reason, I suppose, for doing the moderation is that we are looking at developing the way the formula allocates funding to be on a graduated part of School Action Plus. So it may be low, medium, high School Action Plus in future. So in doing this moderation, we'll be able to look at schools where there are children on the School Action Plus with low need, medium need, high need, to help us develop that next stage of the funding formula considerations, which may be brought forward in the 1920 financial year. Yeah, so it's again, it's part of that developing understanding and working towards a more refined and sophisticated funding formula.
I'd like to come back on two issues with that, really. One is a quick question in that you're saying there's been a quite a dramatic increase in those on School Action Plus this year. Have they been were they using the old PLASC last year? So that 150 hasn't come out of the new document or the new way of recording. That's in the old one. My second question is, given that all you've said about when a pupil comes in from outside of the authority into this authority and how you treat that funding, should we be going down this moderation route of having degrees of ALN? Because you've already said that the school produces or does whatever that pupil needs. And presumably, therefore, if they've got one that's what would be described as low needs, and they've got one that's using high needs, and they're getting the same amount of funding from both, then they would use part of the low needs to assist the high need one.
So just on the second point first, in terms of the reason for looking at that low, medium, high would be to make the formula more sophisticated in terms of allocating funding. So it may be that a low level of need would generate a lower level of funding than the 1800 you described at the moment, a medium and so on. Yeah, so it's about trying to differentiate the need in individual schools to better target the funding going forward. But because we haven't had a moderated School Action Plus yet, we couldn't immediately move to that graduated approach. Yeah. In terms of the pupil count, the difference. We need to check that it's accurate. That's all I'm suggesting. And the PLASC data that we used in the previous round of funding formula was 3-year historic data. So it was 14, 15, 15, 16, 16, 17 PLASC data, none of which was moderated or used for the purposes of distributing funding before 17-18. So now that we are moving to a 1-year count, the numbers have changed quite a lot. Now that could be because historically the numbers have grown year on year. It could be that everybody's got a better understanding, so we're capturing more children under the School Action Plus. We don't know yet, and which is why we're going to check through the moderation process.
Can I?
You don't really answer my question. My question was, the PLASC data, was that the one that's being used for the increase? Because you said there's been a considerable increase. Is that the same data that's being used previously? Is this the same data method? Is it the PLASC data?
No. So the PLASC data over 3 years was averaged to a figure, yeah, and the numbers that we're captured now in the October count are higher than that by a couple of hundred, yeah. So that's in a 1-year count.
That's the new method of capturing the data.
That's the following this process of looking at producing a consistent count. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Can I just say as well that you would expect your SEN registers to change, your ALN registers to change, because you would expect, I mean, the code of practice was that the stages, the School Action Plus statemented, were always decided to be stages of assessment. So if you meet the need of a pupil at School Action Plus, then they move down to School Action, or they move off. If you've got a statemented pupil at review, if they're making progress, you say, they don't need a statement anymore. So you would always expect this to be changing. And one of the things that we did reiterate on Tuesday afternoon to the ALNCOs is actually they should be taking note of the pupils that are moving down as well as up on their stages, because it really shows that they're meeting need. If the pupils are moving, as an ALNCO, that's always what I did, was say, well, look how many pupils have moved a stage down, not just up, because then you can prove that what you're doing is working.
Sorry. just moving on, in regards to the ALN group, what is the strategic leadership of that group? Who heads that group?
There's a service level agreement with Cranbridge School to lead and manage that group in terms of making sure that there's always representatives from schools on there to make sure we meet regularly, to make sure we take notes, and to work with the local authority and making sure the system is represents the views of schools. And then I would report regularly to Dermot McChrystal or Darren and Tracy to talk about which directions that the group are suggesting we move in. So it's a service level agreement that Dermot McChrystal has with Cranbridge School to call the group and run the group, and then we would be working in partnership with the local authority to say the school group are thinking, let's look more into out of county, and if we can have an investor save, we think we want to work on that. If the officers, for instance, didn't think that was a good idea, that's what I would be reporting back. The schools on the group would like to look at investor save. We'd like to work with officers on that. So strategically, Dermot McChrystal has a service level agreement with Cranbridge School, and that's to make sure that schools are involved in the actual process of problem solving. So my responsibility as Cranbridge School is to make sure schools are on that group and schools are part of the workings. And then that feeds into the strategic direction of the local authority, because in terms of finance and how the education department is funded is not a school-to-school issue, is it? We're all in schools working, so that's where we link up to ask the questions of the officers to say, well, why can't we do this, or could we do it like that? Or schools are suggesting, can we look at that?
Can I say that co-construction is really important, because it means that we have that constant dialogue then and feedback, and I attend the meetings, Darren attends the meetings, and we've got other school-to-school groups as well that are ongoing, and it's really important because we're working together. It doesn't come, it's coming more bottom-up than top-down, and that's really important.
I think actually in our pre-meeting that was a cause for confusion. Nobody seemed to know who was responsible, who was in charge, if there was a problem, who they needed to go to. There was some confusion as to who headed the group, who was in charge, who was ultimately responsible for the decisions made by that group. And I think maybe some clarity there to the head teachers would certainly help in that.
Isn't it? If anybody's not clear, the best thing to do is ask. And you can see, can't you, with the model of self-improving schools and school-to-school working, which is the way forward in terms of education. And when we were on the recovery group journey, that's what they were advocating. But obviously, when you're a school-to-school group, you are still schools, and you're not an officer. And therefore, you can't ultimately make final decisions, but you can inform and work with them. So I think that's a fair comment to say, at what point, when you're doing school-to-school work, schools can't override local authority decisions because we haven't got all that information that you guys discuss, but we certainly want to be active partners and equal partners. So we can't do the same job, but we certainly want to have the same voice. And so to go back over that shortly to say schools will, the service level agreement, Cranbridge School will, and the local authority will, would be a way of just reciting it all, bringing it back together, because it's 2.5 years really since the group started. So that would be a useful thing to do, I would have thought.
Chair, could I just add one other further quick point of clarification, which is that the ALN group isn't a decision-making group. Yeah, the decision-making for this process goes through the Constitutional Council, and the executive member for education ultimately makes decisions about how the proposals are implemented, or indeed whether they are implemented. The ALN group is a group of officers and schools, representatives that are working on behalf of all schools and with schools to develop these proposals together to amend the formula. Once they're written into the consultation document, it goes through the normal route of the Constitution.
Mr. Karen?
Yeah, I think this confusion came about because of contingency allocation, but I don't really want to get into that now. I would like to say, right, and we're still on this Thing 2 funding formula. We use free school meals as part of the funding formula. Should we reconsider that going forward? Because we're now looking at a different way of allocating these funds using the moderation, and we have levels of School Action Plus. And why I make those comments is because schools in deprived areas get school deprivation grant. And it seems to me that they're now getting money out of two pots. And is that, can you justify, therefore, particularly going forward with the new formulas that you're thinking about coming out of, leaving that free school meals issue in there?
There's absolutely, there's something that I think we'll take back and look at through the ALN group to see whether there are any different ways, and indeed whether free school meal entitlement should be a factor, or whether the amount of money we allocate through the formula should be at that level. What we've done between 17-18 and 18-19 is reduce the amount of funding in the proposal that goes out on free school meal entitlement and increase the amount of funding that goes out on School Action Plus. And actually, free school meal entitlement is dropping at the moment in Torvine, although that's beginning to level off and hopefully go back up. And of course, as I said earlier, School Action Plus is going up. We are precluded under the funding formula regulations of taking account of any grant funding in distributing our revenue budget. So we can't take account of the fact that we get PDG for whatever purpose in describing how we allocate money through our revenue settlement and into the school's funding formula. And also, under the school's funding regulations, we have to have an allocation within the school's delegated budget for deprivation. And the best correlator of need in terms of deprivation is free school meal entitlement, and that's widely accepted. So it's why there's an allocation in there for that.
Funding theme 2. Shall we move on then to theme 3, which we've got the special needs resource bases. Can you just give us a verbal update on the consultation, on the feeling of the special needs resource bases?
You can't point us to the question quickly, could you? In the consultation document, was it?
This is question 1.
Oh.
Yeah. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, they were all positive. All the responses were positive. That they agreed that the special needs resource-based provision should continue to be funded for the increased provision on a permanent basis.
It's a long-term position for the SNRB.
The consultation process is confirming, by the looks of the general support of schools, to increase permanently the extra places that we made across the resource base to date. I don't think we can say at this point whether resource bases will increase further, because it's going to again be part of the ongoing discussions and thinking of the ALN group working with the head teachers. So if going through that process we identify with schools that additional places are needed and can be met from our special resource bases, then it would be again considered at that point whether we would increase the resource bases or not. So in terms of the current funding for resource bases, that is permanently in there. So that they would be maintained. The consultation suggests that there's support for them being maintained at the level that we've grown them to now. Yeah?
The reason why the group came back to suggest that there were more SNRB places was because in the first consultation, linking back to what we said earlier, heads were very concerned about the high tariff pupils, the high level of need pupils in the school, and if their needs were all being met within the mainstream allocation of funding. So a number of schools were saying that they had pupils within their school that had a very high level of need and might benefit better from SNRB places. So the first year of work was going out looking at these pupils and a rigorous assessment. We were able to come back to say we've looked at the pupils, the first cohort of high tariff needs. We feel that they would be well placed in special needs resource spaces. So would the local authority consider increasing the number of special need places? In principle, in terms of inclusion, we looked at that first of all, and then the second was, well, where would we fund the places from if we did have them? So they've been additional on a temporary basis because we felt that we wanted to make sure that if we did increase the special needs resource spaces, we want to make sure that they're the right basis for the right level of need. So for instance, we might be increasing level of need in a severe learning difficulty base, but actually find that over this year and next it's more of an emotional and behavioural need that we need. But if we've already embedded the extra places in a particular area, we would be trying to find funding for something extra. So the extra spaces that were made this year were a response to schools saying that they had high-level pupils within their schools that weren't able to attend full-time. They were struggling attending school, and could their needs be best met elsewhere. The assessment backed that up and supported schools in saying, yes, these children have got a high level of need. Let's increase the places, which the local authority have accepted and agreed. But should we be making them more permanent in exactly where we first of all think they are needed until we've done a second cohort? Because it's those pupils with emotional and behavioural needs that are high tariff, as well as pupils with very complex needs. So at the moment, over the last year, there's been additional places at Cranbridge Special School being used, as well as in the ASD base and the other learning difficulty bases. And that's been tracked this year in order to find out, have we put the right pupils in the right places? Do we need yet more? And that's because, we want to make sure that the funding isn't taken out of the ALN mainstream pot to go into the special pot if it's needed in mainstream. So that's hence the temporary pilot nature of it, to make sure it's an action research and make sure it's having the best effect.
Can I?
Just hopefully another quickie. No prizes for guessing which school it was, but one school mentioned that there's no Welsh medium provision. So my query really is, are there any Welsh medium pupils in the SNRB, and what would we do if we had a case where a Welsh medium pupil needed it?
Keep going.
Yeah. So I think this is something the school brought up and said it's something we need to work on moving forward. In the past, when a pupil needed an SNRB and had been at a Welsh medium school, we needed to work with the family, and they came to Cranbridge School with a Welsh medium support worker so that pupil could be exposed and supported through the medium of Welsh while in a specialist setting. But as the Welsh medium school provision has grown, and there is going to be more pupils in Welsh medium, hence more pupils possibly that might need an SNRB, is something we've alerted the local authority to that instead of individual cases, we might need to be looking at more of a provision moving forward. So that's something that needs to be added to the work.
And we have talked about that, about what kind of provision we need, so it's on the horizon, and it's actually something that we might be able to do in collaboration with our partners, because they're in the same position, lots of them.
Yeah, given the large increase in provision for the Welsh medium school,
Councillor Preston.
You mentioned the assessment centre. Is it being used as it was initially intended?
It's an action research project, so actually it's a dynamic thing. When the group started working, there was a number of pupils that schools were saying were finding it difficult to attend school, might have been doing an hour a day, not being able to stay in an hour a day for a week, and they were a group of them. So the assessment centre was set up to bring those pupils to it in order to work more closely in context, get the students in for longer, maybe get them in for 2 days instead of an hour a day, and be able to work out, are these children children with EBD needs, therefore we need to not have an assessment centre but to have an EBD centre, or are they a range of need? So during the first year of the project, of the pupils that came to the assessment centre, what we were able to feed back to the group was they weren't all EBD pupils. So of 12 pupils, some went back into mainstream school with the support. Some pupils went to a learning difficulty unit. Some people came to Crownbridge Special School. Some people went to the ASD unit. So what we were able to say is they weren't all EBD pupils. So the second year of the project, we thought we would look at the pupils that were identified as EBD. Yeah, and we would try and use the centre more for those to find out more about them. So this term, this autumn term just gone, we focused more on those students that didn't seem to have a pathway to other units and to look at what we could do for them. And what we found in that term is we've missed having the assessment centre because there's still a group of students that seem to have complex needs that we're not able to bring in. But actually, for the term, it's been really useful to work with those students that didn't appear to have any other learning need but EBD and find out what we could do in county to avoid us paying out of county. So this second year, it's going to. Our thinking at the moment is it will return more to an assessment centre because there seems to be more pupils with more complex needs, not just EBD, out there that we want to help be in school longer and get more pathways. That will help us know whether we need more SNRB places. So that's a really valuable piece of work. And the other piece of work we found out is there are a minority of junior student children with EBD needs that have got a high level of need for a specific type of environment, and at the moment we haven't got that environment.
So that's a point that came over actually when we met the heads. So the question is, what are we going to do about that?
Well, I think the first stage is to identify how many of there are. So if you think the first year, when there was just absolutely students not attending, parents wanting their child to attend, and behaviour was the thing that was the presentation. By looking at those students, we were able to work out, were these behaviour children or were they learning difficulty children? So that was an important piece of work, because otherwise you might go setting up a unit for EBD children that wasn't necessarily needed. What we've found out now is there are a small group, so we do need something. And that's
so heads have requested some support for EBD placements then?
It's something we've discussed because of the learning that's come out of the assessment centre. And I think the important thing to remember about the assessment centre is it was innovative, it was creative, so it was looking at, especially with those pupils that were able to bring their LSAs with them, and that was one of the things we asked schools to do. It was because they were able then to look at strategies that worked, and they could actually see and experience those pupils in different settings. So what we absolutely have done, I suppose, over the last couple of years, is that our assessment for those pupils who require specialist provision is not just a panel in July with a set of documents. It's over a whole year these pupils are discussed. So when we're talking about our specialist provision, we can be pretty emphatic that we've made the right decision and we've put those pupils in the right places, because every head of the SNRB and the teachers there discuss the pupils, with Crownbridge being there and officers being there, Ed Sykes being there. So it's a really good process that we do over, quite an amount of time to make sure that we're thinking about putting these pupils in the right places.
But I think you're right. What we've got to the point of is getting a better idea of how many of these children, and they are now the ones that we need to try and look at providing either Invest to Save or out of county. But if they're a minority group of pupils, but they need something specialist, it's either looking at other partners in a regional, which we're doing. We've also put a paper together to go to the Crystal to look at what would the Invest to Save look like. But we're in a much better position of understanding what the needs of the children are. But certainly they are have a high impact pupils.
Can I ask us a question actually, Sharon? Education reserves, service reserves. Can you tell us how much we have in reserves in the education?
The education service reserves are going down year on year and year. So currently unallocated in the reserves is around about £200,000.
Sorry.
Is the 200,000 as the contingency we were talking about? No?
No, it's a separate.
Like the,
No. That would be the whole reserve position for the entire education service.
going back to the contingency, the 200,000, have we spent that in last year and the year before?
The contingency historically was well overspent. Yeah? So when we go back to years prior to the new funding formula, there was tens of thousands and even in some cases hundreds of thousands being allocated out of education service reserves to supplement the contingency in schools. Now, obviously, that's unsustainable because a reserve is a one-off sum of money. It doesn't, it isn't available for continuing funding streams. When we moved to the new funding formula, the first year the contingency underspent by £60,000. The second year it underspent by about £30,000. And at the moment, we've got around £100,000 left in contingency at the end of this year. And the contingency is set at £200,000 according to these proposals for next financial year. So if we do underspend the contingency in current year, it'll just be rolled in and top up the contingency for 2018-19. So it's ring-fenced into the school budgets and rolled forward.
There on team 3. Sorry, Kathy. Sorry.
Just on the question of contingency, if a school applies to the contingency for funding for a child and is turned down, is there a right of appeal? Is there a way of them then appealing that decision?
Thank you. What happens is that people go out to find out more about it, it's brought to the group, and I think it's true to say we don't say no. We'll say, the group might say, we can't offer anything at this time, but we're willing to revisit and work with the Elenco to look at the provision map to understand better the needs of the pupils, or we'll revisit to look at and give support as to how we can find out more about the situation. So it's an ongoing thing that people could come back and come back. Yeah. Yes, yeah. It's a dynamic thing whereby if somebody comes in and says that their school is got circumstances they feel need groups to look at, an Elenco and someone else will go out, then it will be a group with 9 schools and officers discussing and trying to moderate how does this story fit with the other stories, and if the answer is we don't, because the people on the group are the Elencos who we want to give out money to the schools but we want to give it out fairly, it's a case of the feedback might be not at this time, but if you'd like to return back, or we could come out and look again at some of the issues you're raising. And any things like the increase in special needs resource bases would then come out of that money that's left, in order that you're not going back to schools asking for the 80 grand to set up the SNRB places. We did talk at the beginning of this year, didn't we, about whether we should be asking for the contingent to be less and that money go out in the formula. But actually by the time, the conversation at the moment was that if that money goes out, it would probably be a very small amount for each individual school. And if as a result we felt there was something we could do about EBD pupils more responsively, then that money would be available from that group without having to go back to schools. But certainly moving forward, I think the intention is that the contingency set could be less or more. It's there really to make sure that any theme that comes up that we need to respond to isn't then thrown back to schools to ask them to all give money towards, but it's there to action it.
Because we were able to fund the assessment centre because we had the underspend. And I think, that most of the schools are saying that they would like to see it remain in the consultation at the same level.
Yeah, I mean, the assessment centre, that got really positive reviews. The issue was around the fact that they felt it was much more difficult at the moment to get pupils in. But the question that I wanted to ask here, and there was a general feeling around the table from all the heads that were here, or heads and whatever, that were here yesterday, was that when you're looking at a request for contingency funding, you actually look at the school budget to see if they need the money. Was the impression we got.
Yeah, I think there's an assessment, as Leslie has described, of the needs of the school in terms of ALN, and there's an assessment in terms of the financial health of the school. Because if a school is sat on, say, a £100,000 surplus, then it becomes a question of whether they should be using some of that surplus money, or whether we should be using some of the ring-fence contingency fund that's available for all schools. So it's just simply part of the information that's assessed at the time to determine whether the school generally has got money in reserve or are using monies in different ways that perhaps they could reallocate. So it's part of the bigger picture, I suppose.
No question here, but the feeling was that some schools go out purposely to try and gain income by letting out buildings or letting out playing fields or whatever to try and generate some income for the school. And it felt that that was a disincentive to going out and doing that.
Well, that shouldn't be the case, and we can have the conversation with the heads about it to see whether there is any thing we can do around that. But certainly, those kind of things would not be a reason why we would be withholding funding. Yeah, it literally would come down to a case of if a school has got a very large surplus and that has been retained at a very high level, say, for some time, then there's a genuine question to be asked about why that can't be utilised in some way to support ongoing needs without needing to access a different contingency. No.
You don't?
No, we never have. We need schools to report on surpluses that are over 5%. If they're over 8%, we can look to recover some of it, but we've only ever done that once.
Sorry, would you like to come in?
What's going to happen to the money from Victoria School and Bryn Teg because they're closing? Will that just be lost, or will we just go back in the pot for everybody else? I'm going to go with kids.
So the money will follow the pupils, yeah.
With regards to the contingency, has the criteria changed in the last year? I was just wondering, has it? No, answer that one.
No. Criteria was added to prior to the start of the 17-18 round to include that option around schools that are experiencing difficulties during the transition funding allocation, but that it is as it stands in the consultation document now for 18-19.
So it's not more difficult to access now than it has been previously. I just wonder, there's so much left in it. Is that the reason the schools are not applying for it?
I think when the schools, I'm going to speak from a school's point of view, new to Torfaen, you might go out, because there wasn't the School Action Plus register as rigorously as there is now and so on. So you'd go out and find out, right, this pupil hasn't been in Torfaen before, they are new to Torfaen. What you'd need to find out, of course, is if you've got a new to Torfaen pupil, the group wanted to know also what year 6 pupils have left. Yeah, because it isn't as simple as saying they are new to Torfaen, okay, the group feel comfortable giving the funding. They'd also need to find out, well, tell me about the pupils that are left if somebody new has come in. So as the information available from schools has become more rigorous, then I think the group probably feel that they're able to question more why one's, and I'm talking about schools now, not the local authority. So if there's 9 schools listening to a school that's asking for funding because they've had someone new to Torfaen, they will also say, we just want to satisfy ourselves that the year 6 that have left, or didn't they have, what if, for instance, one pupil had left to go to an out-of-county placement? Yeah. So it's finding out the whole story. So it's schools, there's 9 schools on the group, and they are the people that ask as many questions as the local authority. But going back to the point you said earlier, once the ALN codes have done that bit, the bit about the financial context of the school is really where they get advice from the local authority. Because we've been quite clear, you know, if I go out to a school as an Elenco looking at your School Action Plus and the new to Torfaen, it's not necessarily my business to be involved in lots of conversations with the head and the finance officer as to how the head chooses to spend all their other money. That's not part of it. What the Elenco wants to know is, would that be similar to what would happen in their school or another school? So that financial context is a bit, that's the advice that's given as additional to, but the Elencos are party to that conversation. So picking up on what you're saying, I suppose it does appear as if it is more rigorous. So I wouldn't say that the 9 schools sitting around the table are trying to withhold money now that they gave out before, but I would say that at first, because it was a new system, the anecdotal information you were collecting when you went to schools meant that there was less questions that could be asked at the meeting. But now we're able to say, well, actually, we do that out of our PDG grant, or we do that by using a teaching assistant, not a teacher. I wonder if they could think of doing something similar. So I wonder if we went back and talked to them more.
And I think it's important to remember that, so not this year, but the year before, we did a lot of work with schools around provision mapping. So what are they actually, who are they using, the people they're using with, level they're using them, how are they working across the school? So I think they've all got better at provision mapping and actually are able to sort of present their case, if you like, in a much more forensic way than they did before, comprehensive way than they did before.
But certainly the group are there, the contingency is there to support ALN pupils in all the schools. I think the reason it's become more rigorous is because if anecdotally, without the provision mapping and the School Action Plus data, if you're going to schools listening to anecdotal conversations and it's all very contextual, if all the money is spent by January, then if there is a need to create extra SNRB places or to do something for EBD pupils, actually you might have identified an issue, but you can't do anything to help the schools. You're simply saying, well, we've identified an issue. Darren, is there any money you can give us? And actually if we're all in this understanding there's 200 and odd reserves, this is the 3.4 million, the group are anxious that by January, February, if we've come up with something that needs doing, we can't simply say we've identified something that needs doing, but we can't do it. So rather than, we've been more rigorous with individual cases in order that we can see a theme coming forward and then go back to schools and say, do you support us spending this money on SNRB places, which last year they did? Do you support us spending it on an assessment centre? And in which case they did.
We haven't had an increase in schools coming to contingency. So for the most part, that would say that they're happily sort of meeting the needs of their pupils within the money that they've got. I mean, they're new to Torfaen. If they've got a pupil that's new to Torfaen that comes in, then they will obviously come if that pupil's got additional needs. And sometimes it takes a while to work out whether they have got additional needs or not.
I think what it's showing is that everybody is aware that there's a limited pot of money and students with ALN need that support. And I think all the schools are trying their best not to come unless they think it's necessary, because they're all trying to work the system together for the greater good. But everybody's circumstances are different, and that's why everybody needs to come and ask. But the people want to be forensic in giving it out to individuals, because if we don't need a contingency of 200 going forward, if we only need a contingency of 100 in a year or two's time, well, that other 100 can go into something else. So, but if we give it out anecdotally without too much forensic input, then the money is not there to help with the themes. So I don't think the group are anxious to hold on to a contingency of 200k moving forward every year. They're more anxious to work out how much of a contingency do we need to keep to respond to themes as they come up during the year, without going back to schools and saying, well, we know we need something, but we haven't got any money to do it with.
And we always go back to them and ask them, with the money that we've got left, do you think this is a good proposal? What do you think about this? So it does give us that ability to be creative and flexible, whereas the contingency was all spent, we wouldn't be able to.
Can we go on to the transitional arrangements, and could you give us a verbal response on the consultation? feeling of the transition? Please.
Change management, yeah.
No, that's not. That's the transition.
During transition, it says transition in question 12.
Yeah, 12.
Is it not?
Yeah. It'll say transition.
Okay. So, of the responses, you've had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 responses on that one, and 1,
9 out of 10.
2, 9 out of 10 are positive. Positive, supportive.
Support transition.
Kelly, sorry.
Thanks. I'm trying to word this now. This is where I'm quite concerned, the transitional arrangements. When you look at the figures, when you look at the amount of money some schools will be losing, I've looked at it in clusters as opposed to individual schools. I've looked at it both ways, but I've looked at it in clusters. And there are 3 clusters there that are losing significant amounts of money, huge amounts of money. And I just can't fathom how they will manage that without any transitional arrangement. So I then asked myself the question, what 9 schools responded to that? You know, I'm still surprised that only 13 schools responded to a consultation, to be honest with you. But, you know, I asked myself which 9 schools responded to that part of the consultation, because they're huge sums of money, you know. And when we spoke to teachers, head teachers and others yesterday, you know, we were talking in some cases of staff loss. And I just can't see how you can lose, and I look at Pennygarn in particular, that amount of money without any sort of transition whatsoever.
In the first year, last year, this current financial year, we had a process where we halved any gain or loss. Yeah? What the consultation is saying is that we don't need that because this is the second stage of it, and our school's comfortable with just using the changes to the funding formula as part of the ongoing transition. The responses say generally positive from those schools. Some of those schools are in clusters that are more affected by it. The only other thing I'd really say on there is that the transition funding arrangements that we've got in place up until now has seen quite large swings, yeah, and schools are 4 million or 3.2 million going forward out of about 57, 60 million of revenue funding, with several more million funding on top of that going into delegated school budgets. And they have got the contingency allocation to come to if they need specific allocations, and the school in particular, if you pick Pennygarn, is a individual, one school that is affected by a particular change to the formula. They're the only school that's affected by that. So we've already committed that in that case there will be an allocation from contingency to provide some enhanced transition. So there is enhanced transition in individual cases, but it's on a needs basis.
Thank you. When I look at those clusters again, I can't get my head around such a huge amount of money coming out of such a relatively small area, really, and the effect that will have on pupils. And we talk about going to the contingency fund and the criteria, I can't remember the exact wording, but the criteria you discussed, or the wording you discussed, the criteria for that, you know, is that going to be fairly flexible during this transition stage, or is it going to be quite rigid?
The idea with the third reason to come for contingency is so that it is as flexible as possible, basically. Yeah. So where a school individually feels that they are in an exceptional circumstance, they can bring that case to the contingency. So that is any reason can be brought effectively. Now, whether that will result in additional funding allocation is another matter, but obviously the intention is to enable any school, if they wish, to come and have a conversation either with individuals or the ALM group about potentially accessing some more support if that, you know, they feel that exceptional circumstance applies in their case.
Out of the 9 schools that responded, can you tell us how many were gainers in this and how many lost out financially? Yeah, on that question, on the transition.
While you're doing that, could I nip one in quickly there? Were they aware of how much money they were going to lose at the point that they were spoken? That's
Four gainers, sorry, 6 losers. So it's pretty even. Can I just say that I think it's important to remember with this funding formula, it's replaced the old ALN panel, the old SEN panel, where you bought individual cases and individual pots of money, and you know, I'm convinced that that was never a fair system either, because, you know, if you were very good at filling out paperwork, etc., you might well have ended up with a lot more money per pupil. So I think, you know, whereas all funding formulas tend to be blunt instruments, and of course we wanted to, you know, to absolutely give as much money as we possibly could. We know we've got a finite pot, but I think, as Leslie said before, you know, the one thing about the ALNCOs is they get it. There's a much more cohesive team effort now, and they understand where other schools might be coming from.
Can I just ask then, some of these schools will be going into sort of deficit positions. And how is this going to sort of, you know, pan out in the long term? Because if you're not able to provide the support for the children that they need, it's going to have a knock-on effect for exclusions. So what is the long-term effect? You know, that this reduction in funding and any sort of budget implications as well. Schools are going to be going through a really, really difficult time.
Schools are in a difficult time, I think, anyway. Yeah, schools are going through financial difficulties year in, year out. You know, some schools are having to adjust their expenditure and their staffing year on year. And that'll be for a variety of reasons. So the school roll will be reducing. You know, there will be lots of reasons why a school needs to review its staffing levels or its expenditure levels generally. No school will be in financial difficulties specifically because of this ALN change. You know, again, just to contextualise it, this is 3.4 million out of around about 55, 57 million that goes through the revenue account into school budgets. And there's a lot of additional millions that go into school budgets in addition to that through grant funding. The reality is we are in a position of austerity. The fact that the local authority is receiving less cash this year than it received last. And we're trying to protect school budgets. I know Cabinet and Council are trying to protect school budgets and social care as part of the budget building process. But inevitably, schools will be experiencing financial difficulty from time to time, and you know, unfortunately, that is not new, and we have been managing that with them for you know, a long period.
Sorry, just going back to the transition. You know, when I look at some of those figures, I really do have some concerns. Was it ever considered or looked at some sort of step-down approach, perhaps if you're losing over a certain amount, you know, year 1 you will lose this, year 2 you will lose this, and then 3rd year you will lose your entirety? Was that ever considered?
That was effectively the process we adopted in the first year, so that any gain or loss was halved. literally, we've talked about it at the ALN group and discussed whether to have another approach of that type as a sort of addition to the formula changes that we're bringing forward here. I think the group felt, and it seems to be borne out, at least with 5 of the responses from the 10, or 6 of the responses from the 10 being positive, that another layer of complication is unnecessary in this round. Schools are gaining money, schools are losing money, but schools will be gaining and losing money a lot out of lots of other areas as well. So, it's difficult, I think, to pick this as a particular thing in isolation. Yeah, there are changes to schools' funding allocations in this, and some are gaining, as I say, some are losing funding. But, that'll be the case every year anyway, with different parts of the funding that schools receive. And it's all part of the medium-term financial planning for a school. So, whether we do consider transition funding in future, we'll need to come back and look at it. But it wasn't deemed necessary this year, given the scale of the movement, to add another layer of complication to the formula to include transition sums in it.
Presumably because of, as you said earlier, that it's more on an individual basis, that decision could be made on an individual basis as well. Any problem solving around how to help the transition is so complex because it's not just the ALN funding, it's all the other funding, that actually looking at those schools on an individual basis is the way the group felt it was more appropriate to go.
Yeah.
Thank you. That is useful. So we've got an assurance that some of these schools that are losing huge sums of money can obviously come to the contingency funds if they need to. When I look at those schools losing that money, they're in some of our most deprived parts of our communities. These are, where they're already struggling and on a day-to-day basis, and perhaps have higher levels of ALN. And words come out of, when we sat around the table on Tuesday around head teachers' meetings, and we're looking at potentially losing staff in some schools. And are we really in a position where is there anything that we can do to support these schools? It really worries me that we're potentially losing staff out of some of our most vulnerable schools.
Well, we certainly shouldn't be losing funding from schools with higher levels of ALN, because the idea behind the funding formula is to readjust and reallocate the funding that's provided for ALN to those schools that need it based on the data that we're using as part of the formula distribution. So the school action plus data that we've captured is largely allocated in this fund. Most of the money goes out on that basis. And yes, that is demonstrating that there's some schools that are losing tens of thousands of pounds from it. So if the formula is accurate and right and the best way of distributing the money, that would suggest that historically those schools were benefiting from larger sums of ALN money, and the readjustment is appropriate. So I think we've got the contingency fund that we can use to cover off any exceptional short-term transitional issues. But I think, if we accept, and the consultees accept, and the executive member accepts that this is a better way of distributing money that puts funding where it should be in schools, in the right schools at the right amount for ALN, then inevitably some schools are going to lose, because it's a different way of allocating the money to the method that we've had historically. And that's going to have to be something that those schools manage over time, because the only other way of doing it, isn't there, is finding more money. And where would we find that money from?
I think also element of it. Yeah. Go on.
Just to basically say, you mentioned more money. Our very last bit on our questions as we were going forward was ALN funding is reducing while the need for ALN support is increasing, in addition to pressures to improve attainment levels. I understand that ALN funding hasn't increased for a number of years. The pots remain the same pretty much for a number of years. Obviously that means it's reducing because of inflation. Do you think there is any way we can perhaps increase that ALN amount?
Well, other than inflationary sort of drift, the ALN funding is not reduced. Yeah, the amount of money that's available now through this is still the 3.4 million that's been going out. The difference is that we're taking 200,000 out of the 3.4 to push into resource bases to grow the places. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, in real terms, that is drifting. Yeah. But the reality is that the money that's coming into the council is less, and the money that's going out into schools because of it is restricted, and the authority has protected schools, and that money is being targeted where it's being needed. So, you know, my hope is that when we go and get again the 2018 budget building process, we'll be able to supplement the ALN funding because there is growth in that area and we're able to demonstrate it. So, for example, in the last couple of years, there's been overall pupil growth. Our overall numbers have gone up for the first time in Torfaen. Council have recognised that and provided the authority, the Education Service, with extra money for it, and the Education Service has passported that money on into school budgets directly to match that level of growth. This is the same sort of issue. But we're in the process of the budget build at the moment, and we'll have to see how that develops.
So what you're saying is that if members appreciate that we need more money in the ALN budget, when it comes to the budget proposals, part of our corporate plan is supporting education and protecting our most vulnerable. Then members, we need perhaps to make our voices heard that there is more money needed for ALN funding. Sure you attend the budget meeting. Yeah. John Sheridan, please.
Thank you, Chair. Two points really. I think the Councillor Preston talked about areas of socio-economic deprivation. Looking at the list, it seems to me, on a very crude basis, there is quite a strong negative correlation between those schools which are going to lose the most and which are in the most socio-economic deprived areas. You can't get away from that, which makes me slightly sort of concerned about the type of formula that's used. This last can have that makes the impact greater, of course, on those particular schools, even with transition arrangements. And you could actually work out, I suppose, come up with a figure as to what that will be. The other point I would make is that we talked about there are other pots of money which are increased and decreased. And I accept that. The problem is, though, of course, is this sort of type of funding has an impact on individuals. And you can't get away from that. And those individuals, if they're not given the support that they traditionally were, if they're back in mainstream classes, that has impacts on every other pupil in that class. And so there are sort of knock-on effects, really, for not just for those pupils and the additional or decreased support that they would get, but also other pupils within the school, within the year group, within the environment, and on staff. And my concern is schools will just look at this very crudely and say that this amount equals one member of staff. And it's more subtle than that, really, because those are specialist members of staff who have an important role within the school. So I remain slightly concerned about that.
Okay. Are there any other questions that members wish to ask? Councillor Preston, sorry.
Just a couple of really small points, really, for my own sort of clarity. One of the things we picked up during our discussions with the schools with SNRB, seem to attract more pupils with complex needs into the mainstream, because obviously as a parent you want the best for your child, so that support is there and they're providing that support. Should they have additional funding, those schools? Because they are attracting more pupils with complex needs into mainstream that don't necessarily come with funding.
But they can be identified through ask a school action plus, so they would get them. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I probably didn't get to the point quite properly there. But they're providing resource quite often out of those SNRBs to pupils in mainstream on perhaps an informal basis rather than any funding being provided for that.
I think if the pupils were in mainstream with significant need, they'd be recognised as School Action Plus and they'd be down on their figures, so they would be included. I mean, the beauty of the SNRB being in the school is that you have the teachers and the staff who've got the expertise in those strategies anyway. So, in effect, it's a win-win, isn't it? Because you do have the staff, and then you have other staff who might not be in the base, who are actually professionally developed as well as they go on. So I think inevitably, you're right, parents will seek those centres of excellence.
To Karen, and I think Councillor Evans, and I think we can then perhaps wind up our debate. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, to clarify that point, I think the feeling amongst the heads were, where there was a special needs resource within the school, was that they were attracting a higher level of, not SA plus, but that higher category of SA plus. So that, and of course what happens is, because every SA plus gets the same amount of money, they felt they were losing out. I mean, whether or not that is the case is difficult to judge, but that was the feeling.
Yeah, and we've certainly had debates around that, and that's why we're looking at this more sophisticated. This funding form is more sophisticated than the last one, and the next iteration will be more sophisticated again, because we're on that journey.
Any other questions from members? If not, I think we... Oh, sorry.
I just wanted to say I fully agree with what you've just said, and I think it's very, very important that we all remember that after we look at all these figures and numbers, that at the end of this there is a child with additional learning needs who needs extra support and help in school, and that we ensure that every single one of them in Torfaen gets the support that they need.
Can I thank you very much for coming along and taking part in our debate. We need to perhaps come up with some recommendations. Have you got any things that you'd like to recommend to the executive member? Councillor Preston.
I'm not quite sure where to recommend.
And she didn't even look.
I'm not quite sure what the recommendation at this stage, but I find it very, very difficult to understand how you have these 13 schools, 13 responses. It's not a huge response to a consultation to take feedback and move forward. So I don't know whether there's anything we can do around that.
Yeah, I did note down at the start when you were discussing the consultation process, Darren did mention that perhaps there was more they could do with supporting schools and on the communication side of the consultation process, and perhaps that going forward you could make a recommendation based that they do more with heads to communicate the consultation process and look at how they can make it easier for them to feed back.
I think actually the time as well that they've done the consultation, I mean it started in November and rolled over into December. I don't know whether that might have been a factor, but... Shepard, sorry.
I did feel a lot of the questions asked weren't really answered on a lot of, by lots of us, but I think we're going back to the out-of-county money that comes in. It's just crazy that it's not being allocated directly to the children that's coming in, because if they're coming in with needs, that surely they're not changing that quickly, that these new schools, the new school they're going to, it needs to be passed on to them, if not immediately, but sooner rather than later, and in some cases not at all, which is very, very...
So, can I just ask then how you want to formulate that into a recommendation then, because they did give you the answer to that, so how you want to move forward with that?
The money went into the education service and then it got allocated, but it wasn't allocated for that. It was allocated for the child that came in the county. So
I think, I think we can put in a. I think we can put in a recommendation there that we. I think we have concerns that money allocated to a pupil under a statement is not being immediately passported. I mean, I understand what they're saying. They go on agreements with Newport and Blaenau Gwent and whatever, but the bottom line is, it comes back to that legal thing. And I said, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute it is illegal. I've had a reconsideration since the last time we spoke, but I do feel that it's not morally correct. If nothing else, and as a consequence, I think, and I do believe that if we were taken for judicial review by a parent, we'd be run out the street.
I think the point Darren made was the legacy issues.
Yeah.
I've been in this since 1989. The statements were a difficulty in 1989 because the local authority was trying to stop them, and they've been trying to stop statements for as long as I can remember because they don't like them because they're very expensive. And they're not generally all that accurate, and they exist basically for the time that pupil's in school. And sometimes it's not necessary for the entire period that the child is in school. So I understand why they don't like them, but they are a legal document, and so I find it difficult that we treat them as lightly as we do.
Dr. John Sheridan.
It's just a no-brainer, really. Surely the money should just go straight to the school. Because the danger is that unfortunately it opens up the possibility that schools are going to be less than helpful in facilitating that child's move to the school if they know they're going to lose 15 or 20,000 with that school. So you don't create the problem in the first place. They just go straight to the school. I can't see what the problem is.
They said yesterday, the school said they've got no option. They've got to take a child.
So I think that's a very strong recommendation, and that's a unanimous recommendation from everybody.
I have a recommendation.
Sorry, Councillor.
I'd like to put in a recommendation that the School Action Plus grading system is pushed through as quickly as possible, because we could easily have schools in Torfaen who 80% of their School Action Plus are actually higher level, and they are not receiving the amount of funding that they require, where another school may have 80% of lower funding, so they are still actually receiving more money than they need. So I think that needs to be done sooner rather than later.
So we'd like a time scale really as to when the moderation is going to be completed. Please. I think perhaps the concerns about the EBD provision for EBD.
Yes, how that was going to look.
I am a little worried with that as well, because that assessment centre was highly valued, I got the impression, from head teachers, and now because it's solely being used for the CBD, they're not getting access to it. So, yeah, I think we need to, I'm not exactly sure you're going to word that. But, yeah.
For a specialist provision now for EBD, so I think it was reverting back to its initial thing after this term.
And we need some a progress report on what they're discussing and what they intend to do on that.
I think the issue about taking into account the entire school budget when a consideration is given for contingency funding does need to be looked at, because of what I said. It does disincentivise schools from trying to make any money for themselves. So I think we need to look at that. If there is a pupil going in, then they should automatically get that money if they're SA+.
Sorry, there was just two extras, more sort of action points really than recommendations. There was the issue, Councillor Preston, you raised about the differentials between the code of practice and the LA guidance, and they did say perhaps that could be better communicated to head teachers so that they are clear that it is just an add-on to the actual code of practice. And also to clarify to heads the lines of responsibilities, Councillor Evans, that you raised as well. Yeah.
One more thing.
Total AN budget.
Can I suggest that the Education Department request increased spending in the ALN budget for the next budget round, and then we can make our case as councillors at council?
I was just going to add, obviously, you've got the joint cross-cutting committee now in 2 weeks that will be looking at budgets, and so you can feed your comments in.
And also maybe perhaps ask some questions as to whether the early intervention fund has been accessed for anything, and if they've got any intentions of applying for any funding from that, because there was quite a lot of money last year. If we put some more money in this year, we need to know what they're doing with the early intervention.
Sorry, to just
I think the one is about the consultation. I think we did say that parents should be involved, and also I would like to say that scrutiny would need to be more involved, because this report was all going to be executive member led, and I think that it is consultation and scrutiny should have been informed, and we should have had more of a chance to look at it.
That's what I was just going to add, whether you wanted to keep this now in your basket of items at the next visioning process and make sure you look at it earlier in the cycle so that you've got more of a chance to feed in.
Okay, any other comments or recommendations?
Sorry, just to go back to what you were saying then about scrutiny being involved and parents being involved. The conversations we had on, was it Monday or Tuesday, were very different to the consultation, the answers to the consultations that we were getting. It was almost like two different sets of feedback. So I know we've put in the recommendations that I think feedback from parents is vital.
So I think you're getting feedback from people on the ground initially, aren't you?
Yeah.
And you're getting feedback from people in offices.
Yeah.
And they're two different things, unfortunately. Unless you've been in the school, I bumped into an Elenco from one of the schools that's losing the most, I think, as I was coming into here. And I said to him, is there one thing you think? He said, we just need more money. Now he's losing.
Yeah.
He's losing a significant amount of money. So I still can't get my head around the formula. How it disadvantages those in the poorest part of the borough against those, you look at the bottom of the sheet, who are in the more affluent areas. I can't work out.
That could still be a concern and recommendation.
That came up a little bit, yes, on Tuesday, because they said Monmouth had more statements than Torvine.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I would like some more clarification on this pilot that's being configured with what's replacing statements. What does it actually look like? And how does it target specific needs? Because if it's just going to say your child's going to do this on certain days, how does the specific needs of that child get fitted within that? And how is it going to be, and how is that going to affect the funding as well? And, I'm also very concerned, especially with some secondary schools under severe budgetary pressures at the moment, and they're going to start losing teachers. How the heck are the schools going to have the time with these looser-based statements of intent, if you want to put it that way?
Just one thing that I'd really like to raise. I wondered whether we should set up perhaps a little working group, or perhaps some additional work for the school subcommittee to look at additional learning needs and to see, what the future plans are and how things are progressing, and then perhaps report back to the Learning Scrutiny Committee. I think we could do it alongside the other work that we're doing with the schools, but I think it would be really good if we sort of kept a track on, what's going on, and an audit. So.
And again, that has been planned to put in your basket of items for selection in the next round of visioning, because that is going to be a big piece of work. So that is already sort of at the forefront of. Well, that's how you want that specifically to.
That's why I was wondering whether we could perhaps look at ALN as part of the schools monitoring subcommittee, and then report back to the learning committee, because I think it will be a lot of work if we should look at a task and finish group. So I don't know what your feelings are on that.
I think it's a great idea.
I was just going to say that meetings last
something all that was very much in maths.
I'd very much like to keep an eye on ALM. Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you all very much for attending and for your robust questions. Thanks very much.